Pollen, Darwin's 130-year prediction. Written by Darcy Pattison and illustrated by Peter Willis. Narrated by Josiah John Bildner. Sometimes science takes a long time. On January 25th, 1862, a box arrived at the home of the British scientist Charles Darwin. When Darwin opened it, he saw orchids. The star orchid from Madagascar. A star orchid from Madagascar surprised Darwin. It had a glossy, six-rayed flower, like stars formed of snow-white wax. Its nectary measured 11.5 inches, or 29.2 centimeters long. A nectary is the place where flowers make nectar, the sweet liquid that insects and birds eat. Darwin realized the unusually long nectary was a scientific mystery. How was this flower pollinated? Pollination means that the flower's pollen is carried from one flower to another. When a flower is pollinated, it develops seeds, which can grow new plants. For some flowers, the wind blows pollen from plant to plant. But for some flowers, insects pollinate the flowers. An insect flies to the flower to drink nectar. As the insect brushes against the flower, pollen sticks to the insect. When it moves to the next flower, the pollen brushes off the insect onto the new flower. When Darwin studied the Madagascar star orchid, he wondered how an insect could drink its nectar. The nectary was too long and narrow for insects to crawl into. Darwin tried pushing bristles and needles into the nectary opening, but couldn't pick up any pollen. Finally, he thought about how moths pollinated flowers. Moths use a proboscis, like a straw, to drink nectar. Darwin pushed a thin glass tube into the orchid's nectary. Pollen attached to the glass, and Darwin could pollinate another flower. Like a detective figuring out a mystery, Darwin made an amazing guess, or prediction. The orchid with a long nectary grew somewhere on the island of Madagascar, he said. That meant somewhere in Madagascar there must be a giant moth with an 11-inch long proboscis. You couldn't have one without the other, he reasoned. The moth and the orchid would depend on each other. The orchid would give nectar or food to the moth, and the moth would collect pollen to pollinate another orchid so more orchids could grow. However, no one had seen such a moth. When Charles Darwin died in 1882, still no one had seen a giant moth with an 11-inch long proboscis. "21 years later, in 1903, two entomologists or insect scientists published a new book about moths. Baron Rothschild and Carl Jordan described a new Madagascar hawk moth, Xanthopon morgani praedicta. It had a very long proboscis that was coiled at the base of the mouth's head until needed. When it needed to drink nectar, the moth unrolled the proboscis. But Darwin was wrong about one thing. The hawk moth was big, but not as big as he expected. Its wingspan measured only about 5 or 6 inches. But the mystery wasn't totally solved. It seemed that the star orchid and hawk moth should go together, but no one had seen the hawk moth pollinate the star orchid until in 1992, German entomologist Lutz Thilo Wasterthal, Ph.D., decided to try to photograph the elusive moth at the orchid. He set up a flight tent. He gathered star orchids from rocky slopes and placed them inside. The moths were nocturnal, only active at night. So Wasserthal set up night vision cameras and infrared illumination equipment that let him take night pictures. All they needed were moths, but the hawk moths were rare. During the 6-week stay in Madagascar, Wasserthal was only lucky enough to catch 2 of them. With everything set up, Wasserthal released the two hawk moths into the flight cage. The air was filled with the aromatic, spicy scent from the flowers. The scientists waited. Then, finally, a hawk moth appeared and hovered in front of the star orchid. To drink, the moth unfurled its proboscis and inserted it into the nectary. It grabbed hold of the flower and shoved the proboscis down to the nectar. When it came away, the moth had pollen on the proboscis to carry to the next flower. It only took about 6 seconds. Here's the reality about science. Sometimes progress can take years. Darwin made observations, tested his ideas, and made a prediction. Later, Rothschild and Jordan cataloged new species of moths. They assumed they had found Darwin's moth, but they couldn't prove it. 130 years after Darwin's prediction, Wasserthal made the hard journey to Madagascar to prove them all right. Progress in science needs predictions, observations over a long period of time, and sometimes a bit of luck. Morgan's sphinx moth, or hawk moth, Xanthopin morgani praedicta. This is a large moth found in eastern Africa. Its wingspan is 5 to 6 inches, or 12 to 15 centimeters wide. To eat, the moth sucks nectar through its proboscis, or tongue, which is a hollow tube like an elephant's trunk. It can be 12 to 18 inches, or 30 to 45 centimeters long. When it's not in use, the proboscis is coiled under its head. The moths have narrow wings and streamlined abdomens. When they feed, sphinx moths hover like hummingbirds. They often move rapidly from side to side, which is called swing hovering. Morgan's sphinx moth is a native of Madagascar. Little is known about its life cycle. Madagascar rainforests. The orchid and moth are both native to Madagascar, an island in the Indian Ocean, just off the eastern coast of South Africa. In the last 60 years, it's lost 44% of its forest cover. This means that orchids and moths are losing habitat. Madagascar star orchid, Angræacum sesquipa dala, is an orchid which is native to Madagascar. Other names for this flower include Christmas orchid, comet orchid, and the Star of Bethlehem orchid. The scientific name, Angræacum, comes from a Malay word for orchid, anguric. The specific name comes from the Latin sesqui, which means 1.5, and pedalis, which means 1 foot long. This refers to the 10 to 12 inch or 25 to 30 centimeter nectary. Orchids don't grow in soil or dirt. Instead, the orchid's roots attach to tree trunks or sometimes to rocks. The plant can grow up to 36 inches or 1 meter tall. Long, dark gray-green leaves are 15 inches or 40 centimeters long. It blooms from June to September. When it flowers, it has 1 to 3 star-shaped blooms. It starts as a green flower, but changes to a creamy white. It's threatened by loss of habitat and because it's collected for sale to orchid lovers. Charles Darwin, February 12, 1809 to April 19, 1882, was a naturalist, geologist, and biologist. Best known for his book, The Origin of the Species. He suggested that all life came from a common ancestor, which we call evolution. However, he studied and wrote about many other topics, including how orchids are fertilized, coral reefs, earthworms, fossils, and plants that eat insects. In 1862, Darwin predicted that the Madagascar star orchid would be fertilized by a giant moth. He suggested that the moth and orchid had co-evolved. 5 years later, in 1867, scientist Alfred Russel Wallace supported Darwin's prediction, but instead of a giant moth, he predicted it would be a sphinx moth with a long coiled proboscis. Lutz Thilo Wasterthal, Ph.D. Lutz Thilo Wasterthal, Ph.D., August 22nd, 1940 to present, is a German entomologist or insect scientist. He's been a university professor since 1983. After his trip to Madagascar in 1992, he developed Darwin's ideas about coevolution of the moth and orchid. Large huntsman spiders are often attracted by flower-visiting moths, which they recognize because of the vibrations from their wings. The spiders try to jump and catch the moths. The hawk moths evolved a long proboscis to stay distant from the flowers to avoid attacks of the lurking predators. Wasserthal suggested that the hawk moths evolved a long proboscis to escape the jumping spiders. This meant that the flowers adapted to the moths, rather than co-evolving. Wasserthal also studied how insects breathe, how butterflies keep their body temperatures even, and the life cycle of butterflies. Glossary. Orchid. A flowering plant that grows above the ground. Its roots are not in soil. Orchids are known for their showy flowers. Nectar. Sweet liquid made by plants. Nectar is food for insects and birds. When they come to drink the nectar, they pollinate the flower. Nectary. The part of the flower that makes nectar. Pollen. The flower part that is needed to create seeds and more flowers. Pollinate. To carry pollen to the stigma of a flower where it will create seeds. Moth. A winged insect. Unlike butterflies, they have feathery antennae and are usually nocturnal, which means they come out at night.